The story begins not with scandal, but with promise, shimmering and unquestioned, wrapped in palm trees and ocean light. She was born into a world where wealth felt permanent, where privilege was not ambition but atmosphere. From the moment she could walk, doors opened without resistance, futures arranged themselves politely in advance, and her name carried a gravity that bent rooms toward her. She was raised to believe that greatness was not something to chase, but something to protect. Her inheritance was old, carefully managed, and fiercely guarded. It came with traditions polished smooth by repetition and expectations disguised as affection. She was praised for grace, for restraint, for knowing when not to speak. Independence was admired in theory but discouraged in practice. Her life was curated to appear effortless even as it grew increasingly narrow. She was not being prepared for freedom, but for preservation. Then came the house, vast and dazzling, rising from the Florida coast like a monument to permanence. It was more than a residence. It was a symbol, a stage, a promise that history itself could be domesticated and displayed. To outsiders, it represented glamour and access, a gateway into a rarefied world. To her, it became something far more complicated. What had once been refuge slowly transformed into obligation, then into leverage. At first, the transformation was subtle. Decisions framed as practical necessities, compromises justified as temporary. Control did not arrive as force, but as guidance. Advisors multiplied. Legal language replaced conversation. She was assured that everything was being done in her best interest, that stewardship required sacrifice, that legacy demanded flexibility. Each concession seemed small on its own, almost reasonable, but together they redrew the boundaries of her life. The house began to consume not just resources, but attention, loyalty, and time. It demanded maintenance beyond money, a constant negotiation with influence and power. The space filled with people whose proximity depended on usefulness, whose smiles carried calculation. Privacy eroded quietly, replaced by spectacle. Her identity blurred into the architecture, her name increasingly inseparable from the property itself. She was still wealthy, still admired, still technically in control, yet something essential had shifted. Decisions about her own future were now filtered through others. Her voice softened in rooms where it once carried authority. Contracts replaced trust. She became a participant in her own displacement, watching as her inheritance was reshaped into something she no longer recognized. What made the tragedy sharper was that it unfolded behind an illusion of success. From the outside, it appeared as savvy transformation, as modernization. The house thrived as a symbol of power, its visibility growing even as her autonomy shrank. Praise flowed toward the spectacle, not the woman who had once been its steward. Her role became ceremonial, then conditional, then quietly expendable. Legal battles followed, drawn out and exhausting. They drained not only finances, but spirit. Each proceeding reduced a life into arguments and clauses, stripping away nuance and memory. The heiress who had once embodied continuity was recast as an obstacle, a complication to be managed. The very systems designed to protect inheritance became tools that accelerated its erosion. Isolation followed naturally. Old allies distanced themselves. New relationships felt transactional. Trust became difficult, then impossible. The world she had been raised to navigate turned opaque, hostile in its politeness. She was surrounded constantly, yet profoundly alone, living inside a structure that bore her history but no longer served her future. The house endured. Its walls gleamed, its reputation expanded, its power consolidated. Meanwhile, the woman whose lineage made it possible faded from the narrative. Her story was flattened into footnotes, her resistance framed as instability, her pain as inconvenience. Wealth remained, but belonging did not. What was lost was not merely property, but authorship. Her life ceased to feel like her own. The promise of inheritance, once a shield, became a trap. The tragedy was not that she lacked resources, but that resources could not protect her from displacement within her own legacy. In the end, the house stood triumphant, a testament to ambition unchecked by loyalty, and she, once seen as untouchable, was left diminished not by poverty, but by proximity to power that required her erasure to fully assert itself. From the moment she was born, inheritance was presented as protection. It surrounded her like a fortress, solid and unquestioned, promising safety from uncertainty and distance from ordinary fear. Wealth was described as insulation, legacy as armor. She was taught that her position in the world was secure not because of vigilance, but because of lineage. In this way, vulnerability was never discussed, only permanence. Yet inheritance does not arrive neutral. It carries expectations, dependencies, and silent obligations that shape behavior long before consent is possible. What appeared to be privilege was also a framework of control, carefully disguised as care. Decisions about her future were made early, gently, and always in her name. She was encouraged to trust that others knew best, that experience outweighed intuition, that stewardship required deference. Over time, this trust became habit, and habit became exposure. The paradox of inherited wealth is that it attracts guardians who often function as gatekeepers. Lawyers, advisors, managers, and confidants accumulate around the fortune, each indispensable, each positioned as protector. Their authority grows as her autonomy subtly recedes. She remained the owner in title, but ownership in practice became fragmented, filtered through layers of expertise she was never meant to challenge. To question them was framed as recklessness, ingratitude, or emotional instability. Because she had never been allowed to experience scarcity, she was assumed incapable of understanding risk. This assumption justified exclusion from critical decisions. Conversations shifted from inclusive to advisory, then to procedural, then to private. Documents arrived fully formed. Choices were presented as fate's accomplice. Her consent became symbolic rather than substantive, a signature validating processes already underway. Inheritance also made her legible in dangerous ways. Her wealth was visible, her assets fixed, her life predictable. Unlike those who build fortunes through movement and reinvention, she was anchored to property, tradition, and public record. This made her easier to maneuver around. Power consolidated not by stealing from her directly, but by reshaping the structures through which her wealth was exercised. What deepened the vulnerability was the emotional framing of legacy. She was reminded constantly of responsibility, of honoring the past, of preserving something larger than herself. Any resistance could be interpreted as betrayal, not only of people, but of history. This moral pressure discouraged self-advocacy. She learned to equate endurance with virtue, silence with maturity. As control tightened, it did so invisibly. There was no single moment of loss, no dramatic seizure. Instead, there were adjustments, temporary arrangements that became permanent, exceptions that set precedents, safeguards that restricted her more than they protected her. Each change was defensible in isolation, but devastating in accumulation. The very scale of her inheritance magnified the consequences. Mistakes were not private, disagreements not personal, everything unfolded within systems designed to prioritize assets over individuals. Legal frameworks treated the fortune as the central subject and her as a variable to be managed. Her humanity became secondary to continuity. She discovered that vulnerability within wealth is uniquely isolating. Sympathy was scarce, because suffering did not align with public perception. From the outside, she appeared untouched, still surrounded by luxury. Inside, she felt increasingly irrelevant to her own life. There was no language for this condition, no recognized grievance. Pain without visible deprivation is easily dismissed. Attempts to assert herself were met with condescension. Emotional responses were pathologized. Concern was interpreted as confusion. Resistance became evidence that further control was necessary. In this way, inheritance functioned as a trap that tightened when struggled against. The tragedy was not that she lacked intelligence or resources, but that her environment trained her to defer them. She had been prepared to preserve wealth, not to defend herself from it. The system relied on her compliance, cultivated since childhood, to function smoothly. When she finally recognized the imbalance, the mechanisms were already entrenched. Inheritance, which had promised safety, revealed itself as exposure. It fixed her in place while others moved freely around her. It gave her value without agency, importance without authority. What was meant to secure her future instead made her susceptible to being slowly displaced within it, watching as control over her own legacy passed quietly into other hands. Power rarely destroys in a single, visible moment. More often, it consumes gradually, disguising erosion as growth and disappearance as progress. In her case, the symbol that came to define influence and prestige slowly absorbed the identity of the woman meant to stand behind it. What began as stewardship transformed into subordination, not through force, but through substitution. The symbol grew louder as the person grew quieter. At first, Her identity and the estate were aligned. The property reflected her lineage, her taste, her history. It was an extension of self, not a replacement. But as attention shifted toward what the estate represented to others, access, status, leverage, the balance changed. Conversations began to revolve around the house rather than the woman. Invitations were extended for the address, not the individual. Her presence became optional, the symbol was not. Power thrives on visibility, and the estate offered it in abundance. Its scale, location, and history made it irresistible to ambition. As more powerful figures entered its orbit, their interests began to reshape its purpose. The house stopped being a private inheritance and became a public instrument. With that shift, her role narrowed. She was no longer the author of its meaning, but a footnote to its utility. The transformation was reinforced by language. Decisions were framed in terms of what the house needs or what the legacy requires, subtly separating her from both. Identity dissolved into abstraction. She was encouraged to think strategically rather than personally, to accept that significance sometimes required sacrifice. What went unspoken was that the sacrifice was always hers. As power consolidated around the estate, it demanded clarity and consistency, qualities that left little room for individual complexity. Her emotions, memories, and attachments became inconvenient variables. The house needed to project strength, decisiveness, permanence. Her humanity complicated that image. Gradually, she was edited out of the narrative to preserve its coherence. This erasure did not feel like hostility, it felt like inevitability. The symbol was larger than any one person, she was told. History mattered more than preference. Influence required discipline. Each justification sounded reasonable, even noble, but together they hollowed out her sense of self. She remained present in form, absent in function. Identity erosion is especially effective when it appears consensual. She was never explicitly silenced. She simply found fewer places where her voice mattered. She was consulted selectively, informed strategically, acknowledged ceremonially. Participation became performance. Power prefers figures who legitimize its presence without challenging its direction. The more the estate's influence expanded, the more it required a simplified story. Symbols functioned best when detached from nuance. Her life, with its doubts and vulnerabilities, disrupted that simplicity. It was easier to elevate the structure than to honor the person, easier to market permanence than to accommodate change. In this way, power chose the object over the human. What made this consumption particularly devastating was its invisibility. There was no clear enemy, no obvious betrayal. The process unfolded through admiration, opportunity, and success. From the outside, it looked like triumph. Inside, it felt like disappearance. She watched as the world spoke about the estate with reverence, while speaking to her with diminishing patience. As identity receded, isolation intensified. Relationships once grounded in mutual recognition became transactional. People approached her as a gateway rather than a person. Her worth was measured by proximity power, not by presence. When she attempted to assert boundaries, they were interpreted as misunderstandings of her role. Power does not tolerate ambiguity for long. It resolves tension by redefining participants. In this case, the resolution was quiet but final. The estate became the protagonist. She became context. Her story mattered only insofar as it supported the larger narrative. Anything that complicated that narrative was softened, ignored, or removed. The tragedy lies in the asymmetry. The symbol thrived precisely because it consumed her identity. Its clarity depended on her reduction. The more powerful it became, the less space there was for her to exist fully within it. She was not destroyed in opposition to power, but dissolved within it, absorbed so completely that absence went unnoticed. This is how power consumes identity, not through violence, but through substitution, not by denying existence, but by rendering it unnecessary, not by taking everything at once, but by leaving behind just enough presence to legitimize the erasure. Wealth promises protection by appearing comprehensive. It offers security through scale, legal defense through complexity, and insulation through access. For those born into it, money is framed as a shield against volatility, a guarantee that no matter what happens, resources will intervene. This belief becomes foundational, shaping decisions and expectations long before it is tested. The illusion is comforting, reinforced by examples of problems solved with checks and influence redirected with phone calls. But the very systems that wealth relies upon for protection are impersonal by design. legal frameworks, financial instruments, and advisory structures prioritize assets over individuals. Their loyalty is not to people, but to continuity, compliance, and efficiency. When wealth enters conflict, it is the fortune that is defended first, often at the expense of the person attached to it. Protection becomes conditional, transactional, and increasingly distant from human need. As her situation grew more complex, she turned naturally to the mechanisms she had been taught to trust. Lawyers spoke in confident abstractions. Advisors reassured her with process and precedent. Each intervention promised resolution, but required patience, discretion, and further delegation. Control moved outward even as reassurance moved inward. She was told that complexity demanded expertise, and expertise demanded distance. The illusion deepened because outcomes appeared orderly. Proceedings advanced, accounts balanced, structures held. From the outside, everything looked managed. But inside, the cost was accumulating. Each layer of protection reduced her direct involvement. Each safeguard narrowed her agency. She became a stakeholder without leverage, a beneficiary without authority. Wealth continued to function, but it no longer functioned for her. What makes this illusion especially powerful is that it discourages resistance. To question the system that protects wealth is framed as irrational, emotional, or naive. Doubt is treated as instability. Concern becomes evidence that further insulation is required. In this way, protection evolves into containment. The more she struggled to be heard, the more her exclusion was justified as necessary. Institutions amplify this dynamic. Courts, trusts, and contracts operate on logic that assumes rational actors and stable interests. Personal nuance is flattened. Emotional reality is irrelevant. Her experience was translated into language that could be processed, stripped of context and urgency. The system worked exactly as designed, and that design left little room for her. Wealth also isolates by distorting perception. Those without it assume protection is absolute. Sympathy evaporates in the presence of luxury. Her distress was measured against her resources and found wanting. There was no cultural script for vulnerability inside abundance. Suffering without visible deprivation was dismissed as indulgence. This absence of recognition compounded the damage, leaving her without allies or validation. The illusion persisted because wealth continued to produce comfort, even as it eroded safety. She still lived well. She still traveled freely. She still possessed what others desired. These visible markers obscured the deeper loss of authorship over her own life. Protection, it turned out, was excellent at preserving appearances, but poor at preserving agency. Over time, the mechanisms of protection aligned more closely with external interests than with her own. Advisors answered to incentives she could not see. Legal strategies prioritized precedent over justice. Financial decisions optimized growth rather than well-being. Each choice was defensible within its own framework, yet collectively they displaced her further from the center of her own story. The most damaging aspect of the illusion was its delay. It took years to recognize that the shield had become a barrier. By the time clarity arrived, momentum had shifted. Systems resist reversal. Structures built to manage wealth are adept at continuing without the person they were meant to serve. Intervention came too late to restore what had already been redistributed. Wealth did not fail her because it disappeared, but because it persisted independently. It outlived its obligation to her. Protection proved to be less about care than about control, less about safety than about stability. What she lost was not money, but the assumption that money would stand with her when it mattered most. In the end, the illusion dissolved quietly. There was no dramatic collapse, no sudden ruin, just the realization that protection had never meant what she believed it did, that the systems guarding the fortune were never designed to guard the person, and that the greatest vulnerability of wealth is not exposure to loss, but reliance on structures that cannot recognize the human cost of their own success. Taken together, the story reveals a devastating truth, hidden beneath glamour, legacy, and immense privilege. This was never simply the loss of a home or the reshaping of an estate, but the quiet dismantling of a life by forces that claimed to protect it. Inheritance became exposure, power became erasure, and wealth became a system that preserved itself while abandoning the person it was meant to serve. The tragedy lies not in financial ruin, but in the slow disappearance of authorship, voice, and belonging within one's own legacy. Her story stands as a warning, that prestige can conceal vulnerability, that symbols can outgrow the people behind them, and that protection without humanity is merely control in disguise. What endures is not the estate, but the lesson that unchecked power does not need to destroy openly. It only needs time, silence, and permission.